Thanks to Ian MacDonald and Jim McIntosh for inviting me to give a talk at this Scottish Botanists Conference. Just to amplify a little bit, I've been long-term interested in natural history, and all forms of natural history, but I've mostly been interested in the past in areas of ornithology, but also amphibians and reptiles, and also butterflies and moss. And it's only in the last 10 years or so that I've sort of shown a deeper interest in botany. That was sparked by one of those fortuitous trips that you do in your life, where we took a vacation to celebrate my partner's birthday in southern France in the Carcassonne area. And this happened to be in mid-April, and we had a real orchid bloom where we were there. And that really triggered my interest in different species of orchid, and I've been trying to observe them and enjoy them ever since. And this is not just in Scotland, but also across the UK. Now, the one that I'm going to be focusing on today, and the title of my talk is Fluctuations in Annual Numbers of Flowering Bee Orchids in South Ayrshire. And just a little bit of background. Bee orchids, and this is Ophrys apifera. It has quite a wide European, North African and Middle East distribution. It's a fragmented distribution, but it is common and widespread. It's quite widespread down in England, particularly southern England, and a little bit in Ireland, but it's much rarer in Scotland. It's at the northwestern end of its range. And what I'm showing here is the BSBI data illustrating the different the areas that it's found in Scotland. And what you'll notice is it's just found in a few areas in southern Scotland, really from the west across to the east and in the south. You can see records across from Mull and Tyre. Actually, this was just from 1980, just recently, a couple of years ago. But also we've got records in East Ayrshire, up in Glasgow, and across to East Lothian, and also a few records in Dumfries and Galloway. In total, there's just about 10 records across southern Scotland. Now, as I say, I've been interested in orchids, and I went to see bee orchids at one site in East Lothian, which I've just showed on the map. This is a place called Blindwells near Tranent, and I went to see the orchids in June 2014. This is quite a good site for bee orchids, at least it was. There's about 50 flowering plants when I visited in June 2014. It's actually a brownfield site, and sadly the site has been developed since then with I think orchids have been moved to allow developments of houses. I'm not quite sure how successful that movement's been. But anyway, these are very spectacularly beautiful flowers. Here's just a close-up photograph. Of course, we're all aware that they have their beautiful shape and color because they're bee mimetics. But interestingly, in the case of this species, they no longer require bees for pollination, and they are largely self-pollinated as a species. Anyway, as I say, back in 2014, I visited this bee orchid site in East Lothian. I also wanted to try and see another species in Scotland back in 2014, and this was the greenwing orchid. Now, a friend of mine, Dave Clugston, told me that the best site to see these in Scotland is at a site in South Ayrshire, Benign Grasslands at Lendlefoot. And just a little bit of information about Benign Head. It's quite an interesting site. It's actually man-made. It's an embankment on a cutting of the A77 road, which was redeveloped at that time. This has created a lowland neutral grassland, and it's so rich, such a rich plant assemblage now. It's a triple SI. It has Scotland's largest population of greenwing orchids. These mostly flower from late April to early May, and I'll come back to this in a moment. But actually, it's got a lot of other wonderful plant species, including many other orchids, including heath fragrant, spotted, and early purple orchids. It's got a particularly fantastic display of heath fragrant, and certainly in a couple of fields there, you can see many flowering at certain times of the year, at the right time of the year. And of course, with their famous smell, it's a real beautiful aroma visiting the site. Anyway, these were in the early days of me studying orchids, and as I've already mentioned, we went there to see greenwing orchids, and I've said that these flower from late April to early May. Now, being rather naive about orchids, I thought, well, even though it might be slightly later in the year, this shouldn't matter because maybe I'll still see some of these flowering. So I made the decision to go down with a friend, Darren O'Brien, and we visited the site on the 29th of June 2014. Now, of course, many people in the audience will be probably shaking their heads at the idea of doing this. And of course, this was a mistake, because when we got to the site, we wandered around and we couldn't find any flowering greenwing orchids, because they were all over by this time, where we found a few shriveled stumps. Now, wandering around, what we found instead was, walking past a certain area, my friend Darren pointed this to me and said, "Chris, what's this?" And I looked at it and I said, "Darren, that's a bee orchid. And I haven't heard that they're meant to be here." So anyway, we wandered around the site and we counted quite a few of them. On getting home that evening, I phoned up my friend David Clugs and I said, "David, we didn't see greenwing orchids today, but we managed to find some bee orchids." He was surprised at this, because he was also unaware of bee orchids at this site. And indeed, he passed the information on to the SNH warden, and they were also unaware. So this was the discovery of bee orchids at a new site. And it's one of those sort of serendipitous events, just because we were naive about when to visit it. And although we visited at the wrong time to find greenwing orchids, we arrived at exactly the right time of the year to find flowering bee orchids. So just to follow up on the map that I showed you, here's the new site for bee orchids. As I say, we're talking about Southern Ayrshire here. This is right at the southern end of Ayrshire. You can see it's really quite distant from the other noted bee orchid sites. And I think perhaps this emphasizes that possibly this species is under-recorded across Scotland. In each cases, there's usually just a few flowering plants at each site, but they are quite inconspicuous and they're relatively easy to walk past, even when they're flowering. So it's quite possible that there's more sites throughout Scotland. Anyway, only time will tell. Now, I'm a little bit of an anorex when it comes to natural history, as well as observing natural history and loving to enjoy it. Whenever I see natural history, I tend to like to count what I see. And we spent a bit of time on the 29th of June wandering around the site, counting the number of flowering bee orchids that we could see. And we ended up with a count for that day of 110 spikes. I think this is one of the highest counts ever recorded in Scotland. Anyway, because it's such a beautiful place and it's not too distant from where I live in Glasgow, I've returned to the site each year at the correct flowering time. I've also gone a little bit early in the year to see greenwing orchids, obviously when I took those photographs. But I've returned each year since 2014, and I've counted the number of flowering spikes each year. Just here's a photograph again showing these beautiful flowers from last year, 2019, just to show the site a little bit. You can see here's another flowering bee orchid. We're actually looking down the slope, the embankment, and you can just about see the A77 road at the bottom. You can also see the sea, and we've got this beautiful view across to Ailsa Craig. It really is a very beautiful site, and I'd strongly recommend visiting it if you ever had the inclination. Anyway, here's a summary of my data illustrating the numbers of bee orchid flowering spikes from the years 2014 to 2019. And I'm showing it in two forms here. In the top, I'm showing it to you as a table, but lower down, I'm also showing it to you graphically. And what I hope you can see is that each year we've had varying numbers of flowering, the numbers of bee orchids. Actually, the numbers have generally declined over the years. So our highest count number was back in 2014, but we've seen a general decline to last year when we counted 25 flowering spikes. And again, you can see this in the graphical representation at the bottom of this slide. But interestingly, we've seen fluctuations in numbers where numbers have gone up and down. 110 spikes in 2014, down to 60 spikes in 2015, then up to 85 in 2016, down to 40, up to 55, and then finally down to 25. So we've seen real ups and downs in flowering numbers. And early this year, I was looking through these numbers and I started to think myself, these changes in numbers are interesting. Maybe there's some explanation for why these numbers go up and down, and perhaps it's something to do with environmental. Maybe it's something to do with weather patterns each year, which influences the number of flowering spikes at this site with orchids. Now, the sort of ideas that I thought to explore were, are bee orchid number flower spikes influenced by weather patterns? Particularly, are warm or cold winter or springs influencing the number of flowers, the number of plants that flower each year? Maybe it's not down to temperature. Perhaps it's other things, including precipitation, rainfall, maybe changes in wet rainfall each year, perhaps wet or dry winters or springs are influencing flower spike numbers. Very simply, when it comes to rain, perhaps rain during the spring growing period encourages plant growth and encourages flowering later in the year. Now, once I had this as an idea, of course, now with the internet, it's relatively easy to get information and data, and you can start to interrogate these as a hypothesis. And I was able to do this by accessing the Met Office website, and I could obtain Met Office data for a weather station relatively near to Benign Head at Lendlefoot. Now, I should declare that this is not immediately nearby. It's actually over the Irish Sea. It's at a place in Northern Ireland. But the Irish Sea is quite narrow at this area, and it's only about 40 to 45 kilometers away. The altitude is slightly higher, but I think it does give us a bit of an idea about the ambient temperatures each spring and also the amount of rainfall each spring. And what I've got here is just a slide which is summarizing these data from Northern Ireland. And what I'm showing to you are both the temperature, and these are the purple lines, and also the rainfall, which are the histograms in light blue. I've got data here which I've plotted both the rainfall and temperature for each of the years from 2014 through to 2019. So 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, and 2018 and 2019. Again, in each case, the purple line represents the change in air temperature from January through to June in each graph, and then the blue boxes represent the amount of rainfall. Now, what I hope, first of all, you can see is that, interestingly, the air temperature is pretty similar between all the years between 2014 and 2019. So we've got an increase from a January temperature of about 6 to 8 degrees, and it goes up between 12 and 14 degrees each year. Okay, and there's a general slope as we go from January through to June, but we get a similar profile in each of the years. Now, because we've got changes in flowering spike numbers, certainly that observation suggests that differences in air temperatures are unlikely to be an explanation. Now, instead, I'd like you to concentrate on the differences in rainfall each year from 2014 to 2019. And what I particularly like to remind you of the fact is that in the years 2014, 2016, and 2018, these 3 years are the years that we had higher flowering numbers of flowering spikes of bee orchids. And in contrast, we got lower spike numbers in the years 2015, 2017, and 2019. Now, if we look more carefully in the 2014, 2016, and 2018 years when we got higher flowering spike numbers, we can start to notice differences in the amount of rainfall. First of all, we can just quickly look at the spring and summer rainfall, and we can see that the spring and summer rainfall are relatively low, and they are similar to the years that we got lower spike numbers, so 2015 and 2017 and 2019. Now, in contrast, we got higher rainfall numbers through the winter period of the years 2014, 2016, and 2018. And these in comparison with the winter rainfalls, this is in January and February, for the years when we had lower spike numbers in 2015, 17, and 19. So these suggest that perhaps higher rainfall in each year during these years when we got higher spike numbers may be part of the explanation for why we got higher flowering numbers of bee orchids at these times. So as I say, if we look carefully, we can see these higher amounts of rainfall, and these correlated with the years when we get higher spike numbers, flowering spike numbers of bee orchids. And of course, as I've said to you, we got lower rainfall in the years where we got lower spike numbers. So we can perhaps start to try and draw some conclusions from these potential observations. Well, I'm suggesting to you that are bee orchid numbers, flowering spike numbers, influenced by weather patterns? I've suggested to you that the temperature patterns from the Met suggest that there is no correlation between differences in temperature, because although we got fluctuations in flower spike numbers, we don't see changes in temperature. So apparently there is no correlation between the two. Similarly, if we look at wet springs, we saw similar wet springs throughout the 6 years. So again, there appears to be no correlation between wet springs and summers and the number of flowering bee spike orchids in each year. In contrast, wet winters do show a correlation. We see higher spike numbers when we see a higher rainfall in the winter. So perhaps this is important, and this is an influencing factor resulting in higher spike numbers of bee orchids. Now, you might say, well, what's the relevance of winter rainfall? Why should that be important for bee orchids flowering later in the year in June? Well, actually, if you read into bee orchid development, it is known that actually they grow during the winter period as part of their development program. And at this time of the year, they produce one leaf above ground. So it is possible that winter rainfall encourages growth at this time of the year to allow them to grow one leaf, and it may stimulate the plant to cause a flower spike growth later in the year during spring and autumn. Of course, it's really important to emphasize that I've shown you a limited amount of data, and this is very much only a correlation between winter rainfall and also flowering spike number later in the year. And as all of us are aware, a correlation does not prove a causality. The only way I can continue these studies is by continuing to monitor bee orchid numbers in the future and follow the Met Office data, which I'll certainly be planning to do. Now, if you're interested in the talk that I presented today, please, if you'd like to see the details of what I've described, I've actually published a short note on this. This is in a journal that I'm involved with through the Glasgow Natural History Society called the Glasgow Naturalist. It's actually in volume 27.3. You can find a PDF version of this paper on the Glasgow Natural History website. We publish all of the papers from the Glasgow Natural History Society. They're free for download. You may find other papers of interest in this. They're all about natural history, mostly about Scotland. And please have a look through. And if you're interested, please download them. And hopefully you may read the details of my paper as well. But please do take a look. I strongly encourage you to. I think that's as much as I'd like to say. That's the end of my talk. Thank you very much for your attention. And if I've got time, hopefully I'll be on time, I'm happy to take any questions. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Chris, for that. And I'll just start off, Chris, with this one. And Jim, maybe if you picked up one or two of the other questions, maybe one each for the others, would that seem fair? Or is that short answers to short questions?
Certainly. Go ahead.
Right. Let's go for it. It's your starter for 10, Chris. I've got someone asking, could botanists and visitors be behind the spread of bee orchids between sites? What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Yeah, please, I'm relatively new to plants, so I'll be slightly uncomfortable to answer that. But maybe I would. Oh no, I can't have been guilty because they were flowering the same year. But I guess it could be transferred with things on people's feet, possibly. I don't know. Any other panelists like to answer on that? That was a great question. I don't know. Yeah.
I don't know if anyone else wants to thrust themselves forward into it. I honestly don't know myself. I don't know enough about orchid ecology to.
It's a really interesting one. It's very popular and very exotic, and people, they are wonderful things. They are curiously easy to walk past, and if there's any sort of greensward, it can take you a while to find them. The beauty of the Lendlefoot site is it's very closely cropped. I think they do have sheep in there at times of year, and where these ones grow, it's particularly bare. So they're relatively easy to find, but I suspect they are present at other sites throughout southern Scotland, and hopefully some of the people listening today may bump into them in the future.
Chris, can I ask you a follow-up question about that? This is from Peter Gordon. He asks if all the plants flower, or could you be overlooking non-flowering plants?
Yeah, brilliant question, Pete. I know Pete, we're both bird watchers, so I know Pete with his other hat on. I think that's a great question, Pete. If you read into bee orchids, they're also known not to flower every year. It's thought to flower every second or third year. And almost certainly I am overlooking them. I have been to this site earlier in the year to look at them, and they are almost impossible to spot on the ground if you just have a low stalk on one or two leaves. Yep. So I bet they are. I bet we are estimating them. I guess in defence of what I'm doing, I was just counting the number that were flowering, Pete. So and we did see changes in each numbers each year. But I think that's another great question.
Jim, do you want to ask the next question?
Another one for Chris. Have you been out this year, and does the 2020 data you might have collected support this pattern?
Yeah, no, I wish I had. Unfortunately, that was just at the end of lockdown, Jim, and I failed to capture bee orchid numbers for this year. I was really occupied on another project which I'm involved with my ornithological hat on, and I just couldn't squeeze in a trip down to Lenderfoot this year. So I'm afraid I will do it next year, but I'm afraid there'll be a gap in my data set, which is a bit of a tragedy, but hey ho.